Hey everyone, we are back. It's been a few years since I made the last videos, but we are finishing up periods 4, 5, and 6 for you guys to get ready for the AP exam. So we're going to start with period 4 today, looking at the years 1450 through 1750. You want to realize why these dates mean different kind of turning points within history and why they kind of made this period what it is. So we'll look at that throughout this video and make sure we zoom in on some of those differences that will occur during this time period. Now, concept 4.1 is the first one that they want to make sure that you know about, and this is the globalizing networks of communication and change. Now, when we're looking at this, the biggest thing to realize is this is going to be the period for the first time where the Americas join in the global trade network and exchange. We're going to look during this period at the different parts of this, and we know that there have been different civilizations in the Americas. However, this will be the first time, the first period, the first major turning point where we see that the globalization of exchange happens. So that's key to period 4, one of the major turning points. And as we look at that year that started this 1450 in this period, we know that 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And so that is where we're going to see the first time kind of interactions between a major trade network that will happen between Europe and the Americas as well as Africa. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, the key thing to realize is what made this all possible is the idea of advances in new technologies. So we've had some of these things before, but we know that they're going to really build on the classical world, they're going to build on the Islamic world, and the Asian world, especially when we're talking about kind of some of that China used to really be the hub of learning. And then at this last period, we talked about how Europe is just kind of re-emerging after the Middle Ages, and the rest of the world really is the people that are developing these new things. And so we see that European technology is going to be based off of kind of what other people built before this, and they're going to build upon that. And so we see things like the compass. We're going to see cartography. Cartography is the study of maps and map making. And so as people tried to put together what the world looked like, this is what they had before. They didn't even have the Americas on the map, and so that's going to be a major development. The astrolabe, as we see down below, the ability to kind of follow a horizon as we're looking at that, huge thing. Then we also, on land routes here, so especially when we're looking at trans-Sahara trade, we've seen this kind of in period 3 as well, but the camel caravan and kind of the purpose of as people traveled across the Saharan desert, but we see again, these new technologies interlocking these different groups. During this period, we're going to see the intensification, that's a key word that you want to remember, intensification of existing regional trade networks like the Saharan Desert, also Indian Ocean, also the Mediterranean, also Silk Roads. We've talked about those before in other periods, but we're going to see how technology will make that even better and allow it to happen even easier and intensify. Also, larger ships, like we've been talking about here as we look at this, like such as caravels, such as we're looking up here, larger ships that we've talked about before. These are key things. And the ability, too, of just understanding the winds, the volta do mar, the idea that you can sail against the winds and get places faster by catching the wind, key when we're looking at sailing. And then the whole idea of the economics behind this, credit and paper money, it doesn't mean credit cards. It just means that you could buy things kind of on credit. They kind of set up an account, if you will. Not digital banking by any means. We're not there yet. But these are the new technologies that are going to assist as we look through and be able to connect the whole world together. And so we're going to see a trade network here. We're going to eventually see they're going to connect this way and come into Asia. So, and again, the big thing at this time is trying to get around into the Indies. So we'll talk as we look at this globalization and how at this time, first time the world really becomes connected. Now, another key place that you want to look at is there's some of these remarkable new transoceanic maritime reconnaissance missions, if you will. Now, we all know about Columbus, but we may not always think about Ming China. And Ming China, we have the Ming Admiral Zheng Ha, and he is going to be exploring essentially from China down into the Indian Ocean network. And so when we're looking at him, it's really important to understand that this is going to enhance Chinese prestige. It is going to really bring them into the future. Now we know that eventually the Ming are going to become more isolated and destroy a lot of the records about Jinghua. So just when you're looking at this, know that he has voyages way bigger than Columbus did. But we do know the distance that he traveled is slightly different and kind of along the coast down into the Indian Ocean, connecting China to this trade at this time, making them very powerful for this period of time during the Ming dynasty in China. We also know another major player, really kind of from the get-go, before we even get to major exploration like Columbus, you need to kind of backtrack a little bit and talk about the Portuguese. And the Portuguese, we know kind of where they geographically are located over here, that little green spot. And we know that they are going to start a major kind of education system for sailing. And so they have a school of navigation, and this led to increased trade. And it really was centered around, as you can kind of see these green little spots, they set up eventually trading posts. And there's going to be some different trading post cities kind of along the coast. And eventually we're going to see them get into the Indies, which is their goal here. And we know eventually, as we're going to get into, they're going to set up things in Brazil. And so the Portuguese are going to have a major global trading post empire that as a result all the way back to this idea of starting this Prince Henry's School of Navigation for when we're looking at sailing. And then obviously we can't forget the majors from Spain. Columbus being the first one, we know that key date 1492, we know that he made many trips. The main thing that you have to remember is because, especially if you are American and you're watching this, we know that people think of him and we think he discovered the Americas. He didn't think that's what he was doing. He also, his whole goal was not to find new land. His goal was to find a shorter way to the Indies, or the Indian Ocean Trade Network, essentially. And so when we're looking at this, he's trying to find a shortcut. He finds something totally different. He doesn't realize he found something totally different, but we know that that's what brings the Americas into this global trade network. And then we have some other key figures that helped this maritime exploration, help to know what we have here today. In light of knowing that they wanted to reach the Indies, we have three major explorers that do this in different ways. First of all, like Diaz right here, I don't know if I can write all their names. Diaz reaches the tip of South Africa, but does not make it all the way around. Da Gama, if I can write that on there, that's nice. Da Gama makes it and kind of builds on what Diaz does, not only makes it to the tip of Africa, but makes it around and makes it actually to India. And then we have good old Magellan here, which we know that he is the first person to circumnavigate the globe. Well, kind of. He dies in the Philippines, but his crew makes it all the way around, and they're the ones circumnavigate, meaning going around the entire globe. So these 15th century mariners, going into even later into time, we see that they build on each other. They are key for exploration. It brings the world, as we looked at the key concept for 5.1, it brings the world into this kind of globalizing of networks of trade and communication. And these are the key people you'd want to talk about. Major turning point in history. Now, another kind of economic side to this, we're going to see the power of silver and what happens. Now, when we're talking about the Americas, we'll kind of go back to this in a little bit. We know that there's some major silver mines that are going to be found in the Americas. And so here are they. Potosi, you've probably talked about, this one down in South America. We also know that Japan has one as well. Maybe you've seen this in a DBQ before. But we see that silver begins to flow out of the Americas and into other markets. It does, as you kind of see from the map, go back to Europe. But then what we see is everybody is buying Chinese goods and other goods from the East. And so it's kind of a silver drain. It goes out from the Spanish Empire, brings it back to Europe, and then they just buy lots of things, and it flows out of their country. So now they have goods, but they don't necessarily have the wealth. And the wealth from the silver trade is now going to be circulating, as we talk about this new global circulation of silver, moving from the Americas into Europe, and then buying goods that we see in the East. And so this is kind of a major something you want to understand that's going on during this period of time. Also, when we're looking at this idea of the globalized networks of communication exchange, is the idea of mercantilism. You might hear us say that word a million different ways, but we're going with that. And the whole idea of mercantilism is kind of this idea down here. And the political cartoon you see here, it's the idea that they have colonies, a kind of a mother country, as we see here, has colonies, their little political cartoon. And the colonies are then to provide raw materials, food, gold and silver back to the mother country, which makes the mother country very rich. And so the whole goal of mercantilism is this idea that they need to get lots of gold and silver to the mother country's treasury, which we see that does happen. The mother country wants to make sure they have fewer imports and more, as we look here, exports, so there's a favorable balance of trade. So you're not importing everything. Now, when we looked at the silver trade, we saw in Europe what was happening is while this whole process of mercantilism was happening, we saw that they were importing way more, and so they did not have a favorable balance of trade in the Spanish Empire, which eventually led to their decline as a once really prominent empire. And then we see kind of this whole idea, even with the Americas, the idea that the mother country has these different goods that they're getting from their colonies, just like we saw in our picture right here. They are sending those goods to the mother country. The mother country then makes goods out of them and then sells them back at the colonies for more money, which doesn't make the American colonists happy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Also, the idea of joint stock companies would be another key word if you ever had to write an essay or talk about this. But it's also this idea that kind of we have these early kind of companies where they spread the risk around between other people, where you could buy stock in the company, but then you can also share and reap in the benefits. Now, one of the major things that is key to exchange and the globalization of kind of exchange during this time is we see the Columbian Exchange. This is a key one. This would be a great question if you got on the AP test, because it makes sense to us as we look at the Columbian Exchange is based on Columbus and the idea that he came to the Americas and connected the European world with the Americas, as well as we're going to see what happens with Africa as well. But we see that certain goods and items the Europeans bring to the Americas, as you can see from this arrow right here, and then other goods are brought back to Europe. And some of this is good and some of this is bad. And so we know on the bad side, as you're looking here, we know that the Europeans are going to bring all these different diseases, like smallpox, which is going to be devastating to the Americas. But other things that we know, like the flu, typhus, measles, mumps, etc., all that kind of good stuff. That's not good at all. But they're going to bring that with them because of their kind of close proximity to livestock. And so we love Jared Diamond, and we know that because Europeans have been around livestock for so long, that they have immunities to these. However, those that were living in the Americas did not have the same livestock. They did not have cattle and sheep and pigs and horses. So instead, when the Spanish specifically came and brought these animals, they had never seen them before, but because they did not live in close proximity to them, they also then had these different diseases. And then we know all these different goods that they brought with them as well, from grains like wheat and rice and barley and oats, a very exciting European diet. They did bring coffee. We all love coffee. Well, at least I do, you know that. Olives, onions, and so as well as some of these other things from Africa and through the Mediterranean area that maybe you don't think of as European, but like grapes and olives, etc. Now, the other way we see that the exchange brings items that are super tasty that they did not have in the European diet. And so when we're looking at those, we see some key things that are going to impact European history. And so we're looking at sweet potatoes and squash and pumpkins, peppers. When we're thinking about delightful Mexican food, none of that would have been possible for Europeans to even have half of those things because they didn't have things like tomatoes, as we're looking here. The idea of peppers, putting these foods together, corn, huge one that we see as well. And so all the really good food actually is from the Americas, and that's going to be sent back to Europe, which is going to change the diet and increase life expectancies even in Europe. One of the key ones is the potato. Now, a lot of people thought the potato was just from Ireland, but really it was from the Americas. It's going to be huge back in Europe, and then we're going to see population increases happen because of that. But then we know about the potato famine that's going to happen later on in history. But again, that was originally from the Americas. And so we see that diets will improve, life expectancy will improve. We do know, though, first, devastating, it's going to wipe out a ton of the population from the people in the Americas based on these diseases, based on the fact that they had not been around livestock and they didn't have these immunities yet. So the Columbian Exchange, so many things that you could talk about. Beyond just goods and diseases, you could also talk about people and the exchange of people. And we're going to get to that in just a second. We also see that this idea of this globalized world will bring the spread of religions to different areas. We also are going to see that syncretism is going to happen. Now, when you look at this word, you want to think of the word blending. Just write blend. Okay, so we're going to blend different religions together. And so we're going to see spread and we're going to see blending. So the first one that you look again is we're seeing again the spread of Buddhism, which we know has already made its way into China, but it's going to continue to make its way through other areas throughout Asia, into Indonesia as well. It's just Southeast Asia. We've talked about how it has gone into Korea and Japan and down into Vietnam. And so an Indian religion spreads to different areas. So that's a key thing to talk about, that it's native Indian and it's going to be throughout East Asia and Southeast Asia. When we're talking about the Americas, that's really key to understand is the idea of Vodun or voodoo that you've probably heard of, but may not realize that it is a combination of kind of these West African religions with kind of Catholicism and Christianity that we see, especially in the Caribbean, going to be very popular in that area. And so when we look at that, that's going to be some blending that's going to occur due to the globalization of trade. Sikhism is another one where we're going to see the blending. And again, these are individual religions. They wouldn't necessarily call themselves a blend of different religions. But historically, we know that for Sikhism, there's going to be a blend of both Hindu beliefs as well as Muslim beliefs that are going to occur, some syncretism, and then create the religions that we know today of Sikhism. So in India, Sikhism is very large of a religion, as well as we know that the major ones still are going to be Hinduism as well as Islam. So spread of religions happens because of trade networks. We've talked about that before in the last period with, for example, how Islam spreads across Africa as well as into the Indian Ocean as well. So whenever you think of spread and trade, you want to think of religion as well. Now, something that happens as we're looking at this globalized trade world, you want to understand of some of the benefits is basically the profits, as merchants' profits increase, governments are collecting more taxes, and then they're spending more money on visual and performing arts. And so we see in period 4, kind of, and this overlaps just a wee bit, but we're going to see right at the beginning the Renaissance and how people, we have patrons of the arts, and they're going to fund the people that you've heard of. I always think of the Ninja Turtles. I would drown that. That would be really bad, though. But the Ninja Turtles, because those would help you remember some of the Renaissance artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, as we kind of go on, Raphael. These were actually all great Renaissance artists. We know that this really starts in Florence, Brunelleschi, the idea of building the dome on the Duomo. And then we see just kind of throughout Italy, this spreads into the Northern Europe. Huge deal there. Now we also see, besides the Renaissance that happens, we also are going to see in other areas like in East Asia, specifically when we're looking at Japan, we're going to see that kabuki theater is going to be a big deal. And we're going to see how this arts and drama is going to be brought together during this time. We know that Japan also had their own silver mine. We also know that they are going to be developing and spending money on this as well. And then even back in Europe, we know of classics like Shakespeare. That's during this time period. Okay, 4.2. 4.2 now is going to go a little bit quicker. That 4.1 is big, the whole idea of globalization. 4.2 is going to talk about these new forms of social organization and modes of production. So because we have a connected world, because we are in areas like Latin America, North America, and the Caribbean, we have these new types of labor systems. Some of these are built, like for example, in Latin America, we talk about the Mita system. We're going to talk initially about the Inca and that this is their system. And then the Spanish will come along, adapt that, and make it kind of for their own. And so we're going to see as we come together how that is going to happen in Latin and South America. In the Caribbean area, we're going to see the encomienda system. We've talked about the massive amount of native labor that's used by especially the Spanish in this case. And we have the encomienda system, really brutal, the idea of how they're going to force native laborers to work for the Spanish Empire. And so we see this enslavement of native people with the encomienda system. This could be a great essay question if you were to describe kind of the labor here. We've seen in the past, we've described the labor system between the Americas and the Ottoman Empire. And so it could be a really good thing. And lots of evidence that you could talk about, name drop things like the encomienda system, explain the enslavement of natives, talking about the Mita, how it started with the Inca but then was adapted in the South America. In the North American colonies, we see initially this idea of indentured servitude of people that are moving to the Americas. But then we see, over time, with all of these areas, the development of, with the massive amounts of deaths that occur to natives due to the Columbian Exchange, we see some other systems that will develop over time, that being the slave trade. And so the slave trade is mostly going to be based off of West and Central Africa, will be the key areas, but it does happen from other areas as well. And we're going to see, and this is kind of the thing that every year people forget, that a majority of slaves are going to go to two different areas, one being South America in general, and then going to the Caribbean. We have a very small percent that is going to come to the Americas or North America. And when we're thinking about that, that kind of comes into the idea of our, maybe if you're American, your American perspective is thinking of slavery being a big deal, which it absolutely was. But I want you to remember how big of a deal it was when we're looking at the Caribbean and South America. And you could see the areas of Africa at where people are coming from. And you can see from this map, like who's dominating where. We still know that the green areas being the Spanish is the largest area, but the Portuguese and Brazil also a major player in the slave trade. And no one's really exempt because we know that many Europeans, even if you're not Spanish or Portuguese, are going to be involved in the slave trade, including Great Britain, even though they will not have as many slaves. So we'll look at this as we move forward. Another outcome of this is going to be these new social hierarchies that exist due to this. And so we know that if you're looking at the Spanish Americas, we know that the peninsulares are going to have the most power, as we look here, and the fewest people there. These are the people that were born in the peninsula, if that helps. People like the Iberian Peninsula from Spain that moved to the Americas and are now in the Americas. And so they're born in Spain, but a lot of times they have the most power in the American colonies that we see throughout the Spanish Empire. Then the Creoles are going to be 100% Spanish or of European descent, but they are going to be born in the colonies. So they don't know Europe. They know the Americas. So that's where they were born, but ethnically they are 100% European, okay? Then we have some mixture, and there's like some subcategories to all these things. This is kind of the very basic way to look at the social hierarchies in this time. But mestizos are going to be the mix of natives or Native Americans and people who are European. Mulatto is going to be a mix of African and European. We don't use that term anymore today. But then, as for modern day times, obviously, are kind of the bottom rung here with the most people with the least power. We see people who are natives in the Americas and also those of African descent that have been sent there against their will because of the slave trade. So these new hierarchies emerge, and there's lots of subcastes, if you will, and classes in this system to rank basically based on skin color, who has more power there. And so new social hierarchies will emerge because of this. Good analysis, good thing to talk about if you ever had a short answer or an essay about that. And then the final part, which sometimes I think we go to first, is the idea of these major empires during this period of time. And so you could split them up into two categories. Those that are maritime empires, those that are land empires. Maritime empires are going to establish colonies around the globe. Our biggest one, obviously, during this time period is the Spanish. We know about the Portuguese, which are going to be in Brazil, and then having their different trading posts. And then other players that you can't forget and leave out. The Dutch Empire, who are going to be in the Indian Ocean, the French, the British, which as we went into period 5, we're going to go from a little bit of power to some major power, especially as we look at Africa and we look at Asia. Now there's going to be some land empires in Africa. We're going to have the Songhai. And then when you look just down below, you're going to see all these other ones on the map. We're going to see the Ottoman Empire. We're going to see the Safavid. We're going to see the Mughal. These often are called our gunpowder empires. And they are all during this period. We also know that they're all Islamic empires. We see Tsarist Russia's come into the party here. A large empire, especially as they move east across Asia. And then we have the Qing Empire. So we have Ming and Qing in China. That will happen over this period. Qing even more so into period 5. But these are the major empires that you'll want to know the key ideas about. And again, like we talked about before with the other key concept about labor systems, the Ottoman Empire will have their own system of kind of being able to control it. And we'll talk about that in just a second. And so when we're looking at this, all these different empires, both European and those around the world, especially when we're looking at land and maritime, people use different ways of using religion to legitimize their rule. And so we have the idea, as we have these great kings, here we go, can't forget about Louis, of divine right, that Europeans believed this time that their right to rule came from God, which if we're going to do a little synthesis here, it sounds a lot like Mandate of Heaven in China. But again, we see that idea here. The Safavid, Gunpowder Empire, modern-day Iran, Persia, ancient Persian area. We see the Safavids with Ismail, who's going to use Shiism, or the Shia belief. We know that today that Sunni and Shia are the major denominations or sects of Islam, and Shia is going to be those that believed that power came from Ali throughout the family. It should be passed, and so we see that as well. We know that in the Americas, that the Aztec or the Mexica practiced human sacrifice. We see a picture of that down here. Again, way to legitimize their rule, the activities that they went through to show that God essentially was the one that was leading them. We see in West Africa the idea and promotion of Islam, and still in China, this idea and kind of going back to Confucian rituals, Confucian beliefs, mandate of heaven, etc., use of religion to rule. But there are some limits to and some challenges to bureaucratic systems. In the Ottomans, here's what I was talking about before, they had the system of devshirme, where they would then be able to, we see a picture right down here, where Christian children were essentially given to the Ottoman Empire, and then they were kind of allowed two paths. Either they would become the Janissaries, which we see right here, which is going to be that elite fighting force, super reputable. Like, this is like, for some people, they gave up their children because they know they would have more opportunities. Not all the time, but a lot of times this happened. But then we also see people, if they're not becoming Janissaries, but let's say they have more of the brains, they would be able to work in bureaucratic positions. The reason they use the whole system is no one's going to challenge, if you're a Christian child, you're not going to challenge the right to rule. You're not going to try to take over the Ottoman Empire. You have some you're an outsider. And so they'll allow you to do this. And we saw this in China throughout this course as well, where we have the hiring of the eunuchs so they can't challenge power. We also see kind of this labor system. You could do a great comparison between what's going on in the Americas and the labor systems like the encomienda and the slave trade as well. We also see that the Manchus during this time are going to eventually lead in Qing China, and they're going to have their Q, and this is going to be ways where they can kind of legitimize their power. They are outsiders again. We saw that the Mongols with the Yuan dynasty were outsiders ruling Japan, or ruling China. And we're going to see the same thing that happens here under the Qing dynasty. And then again, trying to use bureaucratic systems, we see the civil service exam. Not all these were always successful at times. There's going to be kind of ebbs and flows to this, but that is key to know. And that, my friends, is period 4. And I hope that helps you review for the AP exam. And again, welcome back. Period 5 videos next, and hope that helps you as well.